Today I want to show you how to secure your REST endpoints with the JWT token. And for this purpose I'm gonna use a simple Spring Boot application which I will build from scratch. And now I go to, as usual, I go to Spring Starter and I'm gonna to create a simple Spring Boot project with needed dependencies for me. I'm gonna name it Spring Security Example, or let's name it Spring Security JWT, and then I'm gonna give it artifact the same as the name, and I'm gonna rename example as com Java master. And now I'm gonna select dependencies which I'm gonna use in this project. And first dependency is web, which enables creating REST. Second dependency I'm gonna select is Lombok to reduce some boilerplate code. And for saving my user in database, I'm gonna use GPA, Spring Data GPA dependency. I'm gonna use PostgreSQL for saving my user, and I select PostgreSQL driver. And the last one is Spring Security. Let's check our dependencies and make sure we didn't forget nothing. Looks good. Let's generate our project, Spring Security. And now I'm gonna open it with my IntelliJ IDEA. Open. And let's find our project and open it as a project. Okay, while it's resolving dependencies, I'm gonna connect to my database. But firstly, I'm gonna create it because I actually didn't prepare anything. So I'm gonna just connect to my Postgres. Hope it I didn't forget the password. And yep, looks good. And now I'm gonna create new database. Let's call it Spring Security JWT. And that's it. Now I have a simple Spring Boot project, Spring Boot web project, which I'm gonna secure with JWT. But firstly, to demonstrate you it works fine, I'm gonna comment dependency for Spring Security, because if those dependency would be in our POM XML, our project will be secured from scratch, and I'm enabled to show you that it works fine. Okay, now I'm gonna create a new control package. Let's call it controller, and I'm gonna create just some testing controller, test security controller, to demonstrate you that without security it works fine. REST controller, and I'm gonna create get mappings for admin, get and I'm gonna create another endpoint. It will be also get mapping user endpoint, because I want to show you Spring Security with roles. Example, get user, and return hi user. How predictable, yeah? And now, if we run our application, let's select another port, because I think I already located 8080 default port, server port. Let's select 8087, for example. I hope it's free port. And start. Oh, I forgot to add dependencies to add application properties from my database, and it failed because it won't be able to connect to database. I'm just gonna copy paste from the previous project to save some time, not to waste time for these boilerplate actions. And okay, I'm just gonna copy paste it to my application properties. Just gonna rename my database to security to Spring Security JWT, and let's delete it while we didn't reach to the JWT security. And let's create a table, for example, user and role, and let our user have only one role. We can actually, you can create your user with multiple roles, but in this example I'll show you only one user have one role. Okay, new schema public. Schema already exists, but it's not here. Schema public and new table. Let's call it firstly role table, and let's edit ID to increment primary key and name of our role varchar 20. And next table we're gonna create is our users table. It's just the simple table which stores user information, and our table will have ID, column, auto increment primary key. Our table will have login, which is varchar, for example, 50. It also, we expect that our login is unique, so let's add restrictions to unique, and the last field is password, which is also varchar. Let's make it 500, and we add a link to the role ID, which is int. We can actually execute this table and that's it, but I'm gonna create foreign key to create a connection between role table and user table. Role, and that's it. Now we have our role table and user table, and for tutorial purpose I'm gonna create role admin and role user. I will have only two roles in my application. That's enough for you to understand the main purpose of security. And execute. Now it's time to write some code. Let's create, let's just run our application and make sure our endpoints works fine and we can get the result of our endpoint. Okay, let's open Postman and call, for example, HTTP localhost 8087 admin get, and we have a hi admin. Let's duplicate our tab and change admin to user, and we have hi admin and hi user. Now I'm gonna uncomment my security dependency and restart my project. And now you see that our endpoints became secure already. We didn't even write code, but we included our Spring Security dependency to POM.xml, and it became secured. Let's open our Postman and try to call admin endpoint, and we have unauthorized message that our admin endpoint is unavailable for us. And to make it available for registered user, we just need to write some settings for security. But before it, we need to write connection to our database. And first of all, we need to create our entity classes. Entity, and let's create first class role entity. I'm gonna use entity annotation and table annotation. And to avoid boilerplate code like getters and setters, I'm gonna use data annotation from Lombok library. And I'm gonna just map my fields from role to my role entity class. Private and the next table I'm gonna create is my user entity. User entity. And I'm gonna add the same annotations for my user. And I'm gonna copy paste AD field. Okay. And now I'm gonna create my user fields. It's login, password, and role ID. And it's one-to-many mapping, so I'm gonna just use, oh sorry, it's many-to-one mapping. I'm just gonna use the appropriate annotations, many-to-one, and join column. And our column is role ID, so I'm gonna paste the role ID. And that's it. My code is marked as red because I didn't assign data source to my IntelliJ IDEA. After assigning, it's fine. And the next thing I'm gonna create is repository. And let's change generation type from auto to identity, and the same for role entity. And create new package repository. Yeah, it takes time for preparations, but I wanted to show you the process from scratch, just to prepare the whole application and show you the security from the beginning, not from the middle of the project or something like that. And let's create new class, create role entity repository. Actually, you can skip this part of video if you already know how to create all those stuff like repositories, entities, and just go to the security part. Okay. And in repository, I'm gonna extend GP repository. And I need only one method, which will return my role by role name. And next repository is user repository. And in user repository, I create a user entity get by, or it's better to place find by login. It's for our security purposes in future. And let's close all and create our user service. But firstly, create a package service and new class users service. Mark it as service. And for now, we gonna create save user and find by login method. And to save some time, I'm not gonna create some validations to validate the user. I'm not gonna create DTO mapping to avoid using entity on controller layer. I'm just showing you the security and preparing some test project. But this test project is far away from the ideal project. And I'm gonna call AutoWired users entity repository. Usually I don't use AutoWired from field. I usually use injection through the constructor, but this time I'm gonna save some time just using the AutoWired through the field and through the using the AutoWired annotation. And user entity repository save user. But before saving user entity repository, I'm gonna add those user role entity repository and role. I'm gonna add my user by default user role and equals role find by name role user. It will be good to create some enum to store our constants for role user and role admin, and I hope you will do this enum when you will execute those example. User entity set role user role, and that's it. I'm not gonna check if role exists or something like that. I hope it will work without validations. And the next thing I'm gonna create is just to encrypt my user entity password. I'm not gonna leave a password in unencrypted because you know, it's not secure to store your passwords unencrypted. And the next thing I'm need is just encryption. I'm gonna create my package, let's call it config, and I'm gonna create a security config file. And now I'm just gonna add a new bin for my encryption. That's nothing more than a default encryption bin. Let's I will use password bcrypt password encoder, public password and with help of those password encoder I'm gonna encode a user password. And user entity set password, user entity get, sorry, I just need to call password encoder encode, and user entity get password. And it's marked as red because I didn't mark my security config as config file configuration, and now it looks fine. And after I saved user, I just gonna return it back. And next method I'm gonna add is just find by login, user entity find by login. I'm gonna return only users which are I found in my database. As I said you before, my login is unique value, so I'm not gonna worry about the duplication records in my database by login. User entity repository find by login. That's it. And the last method I'm gonna add is just to find by login and password. And why didn't I add another method in user repository to find by login and password? Because I'm just gonna find my user by login and check if password is the same as incoming password. I'm just gonna create another method, user entity find by login and password. And I'm gonna call just find by login method. And if user is not null, I'm just gonna check if user password is the same as this password in this incoming password. And I'm just gonna use another method from bcrypt password encoder. Is just a method called matched. And let me go to my user service and say if user password user entity get password, and if those password matches with my password, then I return my user entity, else I return, for example, null or some exception. I throw some exception. Password encoder matches password with my user entity password. Then I return my user entity. That's how I will find my user by login and password. Else I just return null. That's it. And finally we came to our security, and usually security just shows you as some magic which happens from the out of the box in Spring, but Spring gives you really power instrument to set your security as you want. And for purpose of this video, I just need only one configuration file, security config. And in this security config, all the magic will happen. And I show you that I'll demonstrate you how this magic works and how to set up your this magic for your purposes. And to enable my security config, I just need to extend a web security configurer adapter. This class is just abstract class which allows you to implement your web security. It has some methods which you're gonna override and customize your security for your purposes. And I'm gonna add another annotation, enable web security, to enable my web security. And let me find a method which I'm gonna override. It calls configure, and for now I'm gonna remove super configure. And what do we have here? We just have our HTTP security incoming object which we're gonna customize for our purposes. HTTP, we gonna use our JWT token authentication, so we don't need HTTP basic, and we also don't need CSRF. HTTP basic and CSRF is just some security settings which are enabled by default once you extend web security configurer adapter. And if you don't want to use them, you just need to disable it, because for example, CSRF requires CSRF token for all incoming post requests. So if you don't disable CSRF, you just need to implement it from your side. Okay, but now as we implement only JWT security, we need to disable HTTP basic and CSRF security configs. And next thing I'm gonna set is just my session management, and I'm gonna set session management creation policy. Session creation policy, and there are some enums which you're gonna use to customize your session creation policy. I'm just gonna use session creation policy stateless. If you navigate to this enum, you're just gonna read what those session creation policy means for you, and you can select those creation policy which you need for your application. I just select stateless creation policy, which means that Spring Security will never create an HTTP session and will never use it to obtain the security context. And next thing I'm gonna customize is my requests. I want some requests to be for users with role admin, and others URLs will be able just for users with role user, and some URLs like authorization and registration I want to be able for all users. It doesn't matter is it admin or user, or is just anonymous user, or unauthenticated user, and for to customize those URLs, I'm gonna use authorized requests and matchers. And in end matchers, you just pass your pattern for your URL. For example, first pattern would be, let's call it admin, and everything which is after admin is all who wants to obtain the admin URLs should have admin role, has role. Be careful with has role, because if you navigate to has role implementation, you'll see that Spring just adds to your role a role prefix, and that's why in my role table I have name role admin, but in my security I just paste admin, because Spring just concate the role and admin, and the result would be will be the role admin. Okay, be very careful with those naming. And other end matcher is just user has role user. And I want my registration, and for example, let's call it auth endpoints, to permit everyone who wants to register and to authenticate on our application. Let's call it register and auth, and permit all, which means that I permit those URLs to all users. And what I'm gonna add is just filter before to filter incoming requests. Select, for example, token, because my user will use token to authenticate, to make requests, and I'm gonna get those token and find user and put those user to security context holder, and that's how my Spring security will know which user with which role is making the request. And that's how all the security works from scratch, but in different implementations. Add filter before, and I didn't create filter yet. I haven't created those filter, but I'm just gonna pass null, and I'm gonna create username password authentication filter. What does it that means? What does it mean? It means that I'm gonna use a username password authentication filter. My Spring add filter before method has some filters, some list of filters which are allowed to be passed in those filter method. So if you navigate to add filter, it just says that if class matches those those list of filters, then it will register your filter as filter before. And yeah, I'm gonna navigate to my config and config package and create my filter. Let's call it let's just separate our JWT with from the custom configs and create package JWT, and let's create JWT filter. And my filter would be will be extend web secure sorry generic filter bin. Why generic filter bin? Actually, it doesn't matter which filter are you using. You can use one per request filter or generic filter bin or other filter you want, but I liked those filter and it works fine for me. It has only one method, do filter. I'm gonna add component annotation to make those filter injectable, and for now I'm just gonna uh, pass some login. Let's call log from Lombok library, and I'm just gonna show you that it works. Just gonna call log info do filter, for example, and gonna run our application. But firstly, I'm gonna inject my filter to the filter. JWT filter. Actually, that's all about security your Spring your REST endpoints. The next part of video I'll show you just how to generate the token and obtain user from the token, and it's all you need to secure your application. And let me show you that my JWT filter works fine. Just to show you output in my console, let's for example call my admin get method and navigate to my console, and I see do filter. Why do I see to awk status? Because I just didn't filter the request, but I see for now I see do filter. That means that my filter works fine. And now I'm gonna continue with JWT filter, but firstly let me just create a JWT, let's call provider. It's just simple class to generate the token and to validate the token. And I'm gonna add component to those class, and one dependency I'm gonna use is just JWT dependency. And let me just copy paste it from my previous project, not to show, to avoid internet research. Json web token dependency, which this dependency allows me to use to generate my token and to store some information in my token. That's it. And in JWT provider, I'm gonna create first method is generate token, and the incoming param is only user login. And now I'm gonna return this library which I added. JSON web token has builder, JWTS builder, which allows to build your JWT. Set subject, I'm gonna set subject login. I'm gonna set expiration date, but it's not necessary. I just add it for testing purposes. It requires date object. I'm just gonna create date. I don't really like date objects, so I'm gonna just generate date from the local date. I'm gonna create date from local date now, and let's our token have, for example, 15 days for expiration. I think it's enough for users. Okay, and I'm gonna just call some method to generate date from local date, zone ID, system default. And that's it. Now I have my date from a local date time and expiration date. Next thing, I just need to sign my JWT token. I select algorithm. There are a lot of algorithms. You can see it's just enum. We use all the algorithms. You can navigate to those sites to see all information about standard JWT signature. But I'm just gonna use HS512, and I'm gonna sign my JWT with my secret key. It's good practice to store your secrets, for example, in AWS storage or in other storage secured by. For this tutorial, I'm just gonna store my JWT key in my application properties, and I don't want to print it again. I'm just gonna create a new property, JWT secret, and I'm gonna get those property from my application properties. Let's run import. JWT, and my value is $, and in my brackets JWT secret. Looks good. JWT secret, and with those secret I'm gonna assign my token, and I call compact to build my JWT token. And next thing I'm gonna add is just boolean, a method which return boolean value, validate token. And this method just parse the token, which incoming token. I'm just gonna set sign key the same which I used to sign with, because you know, to parse your token you just need to use those key. It's secret key, and I'm gonna call parse climbs JWS and paste token. And this method actually throws a lot of exceptions: expired JWT token, unsupported JWT token, malformed. And you actually, it's good practice to just to separate your exceptions, to recognize every exception your token your parse token fails. But to save your time and to save my time, first I'm just gonna wrap everything in one exception. But you don't do this, you just don't be lazy as me and just navigate to this method and separate your catch to different catch exceptions. Catch, I'm just gonna wrap it with my just one exception and log the error. I'm just gonna use a log from Lombok. Log and that's it. And return, don't forget to return true, and if something happened, just return false, and you make sure that your token is invalid. And the last method I'm gonna add to those class is just get login from the token. As you remember, I put login to the subject, and now I'm just gonna get those login from the subject. Actually, you can just put any information you want to the token, but make sure you don't pass some sensitive information like password or other stuff for user. And I'm gonna use another method, another object from the library JWT token. It's just claims, which I can get from the, oh, I have my autocomplete, works fine. My secret name is JWT secret, and I return claims get subject, because I put subject to my token in generate token method. So if user makes a request with valid token which he generated in those methods, so the login will be in those token. And that's it. Let's navigate to our JWT filter, and let's try to get our token from the request. It's actually very easy. Just create some private method get token from request, and as you can see, we have servlet request which can be casted to HTTP servlet request. HTTP servlet request, and this HTTP servlet request has header attribute. Oh, my autocomplete works fine. It's just Codota plugin which I installed for my IntelliJ IDEA, and I'm gonna just create a variable for better code view, and I say if my bearer token is not null or is not empty, or I just can union its this checks in one method. Method name has text. This is just method from the utils bearer string utils. You know, string utils is very useful library. It has some very useful methods. For example, has text, which returns your which checks your string on null, and also checks if your string is not empty. So I'm gonna call has text and reduce my code to write, and I'm gonna check if my bearer token starts from the bearer, because actually if you navigate to your Postman and go to authorization, we will use bearer token. It will add to the header before the token bearer param bearer. So this is my token, and this is just bearer param, which indicates that its token, this token is bearer token. So I'm gonna check if my token starts from the bearer. I need just to remove those bearer to get only my token value without some additional params like bearer. and I'm gonna check if my token starts from bearer. Then I'm just gonna remove those bearer from the token. I just need my bearer substring, and my bearer has, I just need to know how much elements I need to substring. 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 7 symbols. If my token is empty or null or doesn't start from the bearer, I just return null because something is wrong with my token. And I just gonna call those method in my do filter and pass servlet request. That's it. And I'm gonna cast my servlet request to HTTP servlet request. And I check if my token is not null, and I check if my token is valid. I just wrote the validation check for token in JWT provider. I'm just gonna inject those provided in my JWT filter. And if my JWT filter validate, oh, not JWT provider, validate token my token. So if my token is valid, this method just return true, and my if will pass, my if statement will pass and go to the next statement. I'm just gonna create my user entity from. I'm just gonna select my login from the token, find my user in database by login, and paste my user to user details Spring Security, inject it in Spring Security, and that's it. That's how my Spring config will know about my user and about role of my user. But firstly, let's check, let's select the login from the token, string user login, and use our get login from the token method. And I need to add some classes from the Spring Security configurations from the Spring library. I'm just gonna add custom user details, because Spring actually expects you to pass the class from you pass user details to your security context, because actually Spring needs to know which user, which authorities does this user have, and for this purpose user details class exists. But you can just implement those user details and customize your user details as you want. I'm just gonna implement user details. It's just from the Spring Security library, and I'm gonna override some methods which is used here. It's just is enabled, is credentials not expired, is account not locked. We don't use it for our lesson, but you can use those methods if you want. I'm just gonna make all those Boolean statements as true to allow my user pass security, because my account is not expired. Yes, it's not expired. It's my account is not locked. Yes, it's not locked, because I don't lock accounts, don't expire accounts, I expire only tokens. but some configs, some security configs has account expired flag and account locked flag, so you can customize those methods. Was added for you just if you want to customize your security and add more functionality to your security. And I'm gonna just add my fields. It's login field and my password field. And in my password, I'm gonna return password. In my username, I'm just gonna return my login, because you know in Spring it's just username field. And the last thing is just granted authorities. It's just roles which you add to your user. It's collection. I'm just gonna copy paste it from this method. And as you can see, it's just collection, because Spring expects gives you opportunity to allow your users multiple roles. For example, your user can have role admin, and at the same time he can have role user, and other user just can have role admin. But for this video, I just show you one user. User will have only one role in my video, but you can customize your security as you want. And in this collection, I'm just gonna return granted authorities. And next thing I'm gonna add to those custom user details is some converter to convert my user entity to custom user details. I'm just gonna create method static custom user details from user entity and I'm just gonna pass my user params, user entity params to my custom user details. And the main thing I'm gonna pass is just my granted authorities, but I'm just gonna pass login equals user entity and password equals user entity get password. And granted authorities would be, just as I said, only one authority, just collection singleton list and simple granted authority. And I'm gonna get those my role from the user entity get role get name. As you remember, my role has name role admin and role user. And after Spring, select my custom user details, receives custom user details. We just add those functionality, and Spring library see that custom user details has granted authority as simple granted authority role admin, for example. In those security, it matches has role, just splits role admin role to those role admin and just compares on equals. And if user has, for example, role admin, it just goes to my security, navigates to my configuration, and Spring compares if my granted authority has the same name as name which I put in has role method. And don't forget to return my custom user details. And the next class I'm gonna override is custom user details service. I'm gonna implement custom user details service, custom user details service, extend service, not custom user details, but just user details service. And this user details service has only one method, load by user by username, and I just need to auto inject my user details to be able to select my user from the database and load my user from database to Spring Security user entity service, or how I called it. Let me recall. User service. My user service. Sometimes IntelliJ IDEA refuses to autocomplete my code, and I'm gonna just user entity equals user service find by login username. And next thing, I just need to return my custom user details, because this method requires user details, but as I as I implemented user details in my custom user details class, it's just the same as user details for the Spring Boot, and I just can to change those signature to custom user details, and nothing happened. Spring and my code doesn't fail and compile, and I'm just going to return custom user details from my user entity to custom user details. That's how it works. You just go to your database, find your user by login, and just return your custom user details to inject your user details in Spring Security. And navigate to the, let's close it all because it's messy around here. And I'm gonna navigate to my JWT filter, and I'm gonna auto-wire my custom user details service. Custom user details service. And it marks as red because I forgot to add component annotation to it. And I'm just gonna find my custom user details. Custom user details. Load user by username. And I have my username, it's just my user login. Because as you remember, I told you that in Spring username, but in our case it's just login. It's just method naming. And now I just need to inject my custom user details to Spring Security context holder. But I'm just gonna create username password authentication token and pass my credentials from custom user details to those authentication token. I'm just gonna pass. Oh, my autocomplete works bad this time. I'm just gonna pass. This object has a lot of constructors. It's just object for representation of username and password. for Spring Security. And this object has really a lot of constructors, so my IntelliJ IDEA confused this time. But I'm not confused, and I remember which constructor I need this time. I just want to pass my custom user details. I'm just gonna pass null, and I'm just gonna pass my authorities. And for this constructor, it just gets principal, credentials, and authorities. And it sets authenticated true from scratch if you use those constructor. And for now, when I created those object, I just need to get my security context holder, get context, and set authentication. And that's it. After, I just need to call my filter chain do filter to filter my request, to filter my incoming request. That's it. In this filter, I just take my token from the header, parse it, validate it, and check my user by this token. I just get the login from the token, go to the user details, go to my find by login, and select my user by login. That's it. That's how I just created the security. But now I just need to add one more controller to enable my user registration and authentication. Let's navigate and let's create, for example, auth controller and make it REST controller. And first method is just registration, just post mapping. And I need to add URL which is allowed for all users. And in those controller, I'm gonna create a new class. Let's call it registration response. And another class, let's our registration return only success message, and I just rename those class to registration request because I don't want to write more classes. And let's it have fields like login and password. That's it. I just need to accept my registration request and just call. But before call, I need to inject my user service. And user service save user and user entity and don't forget to set login to your user entity. Registration request get login, and to make it at least some validations, let me add a valid annotation because I can't just leave it invalid, not empty, and password is also not empty. Set login. And let's return OK. This is really bad practice to return like that, to return only strings. It's just better to return some response entity, but I don't want to waste your time on these boilerplate actions, because for purpose of this video it's just boilerplate. And let's create another class, auth response and auth request. And this time we return our auth response. And in our auth request, I expect to have my login and password. And in my auth response, I just return token, which was generated for user. And I'm just gonna call and generate token, but before I just inject it, user JWT token, JWT provider. But firstly, I just need to make sure that this user exists in my database, so I'm just gonna call user service, find by login and password, request. Just before generating the token, make sure the user credentials are valid. And if everything is fine, we just call generate token, string token, and that's it. Just return our token, return new auth response token. Now let's try to run our application and try to register our user, authenticate our user, and let's try to call our secured endpoints to make sure our user has access to them. Okay, our application started, and first endpoint I'm gonna call is register endpoint. Let's navigate to our Postman and just duplicate those steps, and I just gonna paste register, make our request as post, insert some body, and my login, for example, would be test, and my password would be will be the same, test. And I'm gonna call send, and I see awk message. That means that my user is successfully registered in my database, and yeah, it has role ID 2, which means that my role is a user. And next thing I'm gonna call is just my auth endpoint. I'm just gonna duplicate those steps, and the body is the same, it's just login and password. I navigate to my endpoint and see that I received the token which is generated from my user. Now I just gonna call my user get endpoint and see what if user has access to it. It has forbidden. Now I'm gonna paste bearer token which I generated and see if I has access to my endpoint, and as you can see, with my authentication token I has access to user page. If I navigate to admin page, let me just try without auth, it just shows me forbidden. I just gonna try with my bearer token with my user token, and I still have forbidden message because my admin doesn't have user role. My user doesn't have an admin role. Now I'm gonna navigate to my table and go to my user and change those role ID to admin role ID and save. And now you can see that my user has access to admin page, but for this time he just lost his access to user page. Guys, that's all what I wanted to show you today. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and that's it. Goodbye.